everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to a special edition, I suppose. We're talking biblical slavery, and the reason is because a lot of apologists have been back on this horse all of a sudden recently, and sometimes it appears to be in response to more and more people pointing out that slavery in the Bible kind of puts a big old hole in that perfectly moral God business. So Nara's joining me today because Nara's just been on about apologists recently, and several of them making excuses for why slavery in the Bible isn't a problem for a perfectly moral God. So we've got some apologists to look at, evaluating their excuses and things. And yeah, it should be an interesting time. So hello, Nara. How are you doing?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, I try to work with, I enjoy working with people. It's always good to have extra insights and extra pair of eyeballs. I know I come up with some pretty off-the-wall ideas from time to time, but sometimes I miss stuff. And you know, the two heads are better than one kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, collaboration is always better than slavery.
That's true. Yeah, you know what? Actually, before we get started, let me just ask you, is it ever okay? Is slavery ever okay?
I don't think so.
Yeah, me either. I'm glad we can clear that up.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Right?
It's inconceivable to me that this is still even an argument. Like, I get it that an apologist's job is to try to downplay the things that are wrong about religion so that people can feel like they're good people for continuing to believe. Even though the Bible is riddled with quotes about how you are. In fact, you know what? I'll let an apologist say it. I have a clip, and I'm going to use it.
I think that's what distinguishes from Christianity from every other religion, because he's still talking about being a good person. And Christianity comes and says, no, you're incapable of being a good person. You're an evil person. You're a terrible person. At the core fabric of who you are. That's why we need laws. We need laws because we're bad people. All of us are bad people.
And
All right.
yeah, that's the fundament. See, this whole thing about the core of Christianity is Jesus died for you to redeem you, so you get the get out of jail free card for immorality. That's just the icing. The turd salad cake underneath is you have to embrace this idea that you are a horrible person, and everyone else is too. And that's why having moral horrors in your holy book isn't a big deal.
Oh, yeah, we're all sinners, yeah.
Yeah, there's so much about that, but I could go on and on and on. But what do you say we start looking at some of these apologist clips and see what comes up?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right. Oh, by the way, before we really get into it, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. If you're not familiar with Nara, hit the subscribe button. Nara is a Sanskrit word for human, yes?
No. Well, it very well may be. Actually, it comes from a video game. It's actually the best video game that's ever been made. And if you Google it right now, that's what will come up. And if you get a different answer, then you have a wrong source. It was from the Elder Scrolls 3. I think it came out maybe 15 years ago now. And there was a prophecy. The name of a person from that was coming to fulfill the prophecy was the Nara. So that's just kind of the name that I stuck with for all of my online personas and video game character names. Well, it turns out that I was spelling it wrong the entire time, and it's actually Nere, but I just spelled it phonetically Nara. It's the Nara.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
so it just kind of stuck, and I just went with it.
Yeah, it just happened to pop up. I was watching Bree over on Hivesci, one of our friends of the channel, was doing a review on Hindu creationism, and it turns out that there's some deity or something in Hindu lore that's like it's a compound word, but Nara is part of it. Nara, at least in English, it's Nara.
Yeah, which explains the 9128 after mine, because I figured nobody would have this because it doesn't mean anything because I literally made it up. But it turns out that it's actually a pretty popular word, unfortunately. So I got some numbers after my name.
Hey, you know, you could do worse than to, accidentally name yourself for humanism.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I mean, here I'm a dumbass just using my actual name on the internet because, I guess I enjoy death threats or something. What can you do? All right, enough nonsense for me. Nara's link is in the description. If a mod happens to be around, they can also link it. Probably, yeah. I see as you technically have a wrench, making people do things. It's a fun time. All right, this first clip is from Alan Parr. He gets into a bit of trouble sometimes. A lot of his videos have very, very bad takes. But we're going to watch him make excuses for slavery and see where we go from here.
All right.
Does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want
Yes.
to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
Do you see how he's already shifting into excuse
Yes.
mode?
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's not
Yeah.
saying the Bible doesn't support slavery. He's saying it's different from
It's
what
different,
happened in
yes.
the antebellum South.
Yep, that's very common. They'll say, does the Bible support slavery? And then, here, let me answer a different question. It's very common, yes.
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so
Okay, so this is technically true, which as we know, technically correct is the best kind of correct. In the same way that God did not create marriage, right? Marriage existed before the Torah was ever written. However, according to the Torah, God specifically told Moses, here's how to do slavery.
Right, yeah. This is actually very common, way common. I've probably done, I want to say maybe 10 or 11 of these specifically slavery videos that I've gone over. So I've heard a lot, and I don't know why this one is so common, because I don't think it's an argument that anybody has ever made. I mean, I've never, from an atheist side, from a Christian side, from Muslim, Hindu, anything, I don't think anybody's ever made this argument that God created slavery. But since he didn't create slavery, I think they feel they need to say that because it's a point for them. It's a win. Because, well, yes, it is true, but nobody cares.
Yeah, I think it's one of those guilty men flee where none pursueth type deals, because they're constantly saying, oh, God invented marriage and God created everything. So they have to go out of their way to distance this thing from God, even though if it was made and God made everything, God made it. So,
You're right, yeah.
you know.
just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to...
Well, I mean, God does do a whole lot of ordering people to murder people. That's
Yeah, yeah.
the Pentateuch is full of that.
Yeah, he does do a lot of the murdering. I'm not sure what words we can get away with on here, so I'll keep it down. But he does do a lot of that. But what does it have to do with slavery? Because he says that our hearts are hardened, but he also outlaws murder. So what? I don't know why they keep saying it. He was able to say, "Thou shalt not kill," even though that wasn't God's ideal or what he wanted from the beginning. And it's because of the fall and Adam and Eve and all the sin, but he still outlawed it. So I don't know why they're comparing something that is immoral, that he did outlaw, to something that is immoral that he regulated.
Yeah, why couldn't he just outright ban that? Not that that would have stopped slavery anyway, considering
Correct.
how well thou shalt not kill was effective.
Right, yeah. People are still killing even though it says thou shalt not. So why not just have that ground rule, but...
Yeah, and there's all those times when God himself ordered the annihilation of entire populations.
Yes.
Or outright did it, even. Although you could argue that the thou shalt not kill, that's a do as I say, not as I do. If he personally or one of his angels destroys a city like Sodom and Gomorrah, he doesn't have to obey his own commandments. Those are commands for humans, but details.
Yeah. Details.
Establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves. And so the very fact that
The proper treatment of slaves. Okay.
Yeah. What's a properly treated slave? I would like a definition, please.
Well, let's see. According to Exodus 20, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished only if the slave dies as a direct result. But they're
Oh,
not
okay.
to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. So, you know, that's how you humanely treat slaves, according to the Bible.
Well, all right. I wanted an answer, and I certainly got it.
Yeah. So, moral goodness, all that
I
stuff.
guess. Yeah.
There is a law about it at all indicates that God did not approve of it, and it wasn't his perfect will because God did not establish laws to regulate or limit good, only to regulate evil. Number
Kind of. There are several laws that are supposedly for the good, like the many laws that deal with building the tabernacle and how the burnt offerings should be presented and things. These are all supposed to be good because they're pleasing to the Lord, unless you want to make the case that doing something pleasing to the Lord is an inherently evil act, and so you have to regulate it and minimize it.
I mean, that it made absolutely no sense because there's, like you just said, there's plenty of laws that just regulate nothing. It's not good or bad. Just they regulate neutral things like the mixed fabrics, or from what I understand, that was simply to just kind of distinguish God's chosen people, or all these other cultures where, sinning and wearing like silk or whatever the fabrics are. I can't remember, but oops, excuse me. There's neutral laws, there's moral laws, and so that just made no sense. Of course, there's laws that regulate something that could be considered good or neutral.
Yeah, and it hurts my head when people are like, "Oh, well, it's evil, so we have to regulate it." You're telling me an omnipotent God couldn't just stop this from happening?
He could, yeah, in the same fashion that like I'm fascinated with the ocean. How cool would it be to just dive into the ocean and just swim around for a few hours? But I can't do that by God's design, supposedly. So why can I murder? Why is that something that I can do, whereas I can't breathe underwater, I can't fly in the air, I can't use my mind to, kill somebody 14,000 miles away. There's all these things that I can't do. You know what I mean? Like why is murder even an option for us? It shouldn't even be a thought in our heads. But
Yeah.
That's why he regulates it.
Yeah, because there are physical limitations. Just don't even make it possible to do. But
Not even a thought. Like, let's say that you could do this like mind killing thing from 1,000 miles away. They would be making the same arguments. Like, well, why did God allow us to do that? And because God gave us the free will to do that. But we can't do that. You know what I mean? So he didn't give us that ability. Why did he even give us the ability to murder in the first place? But anyway, back to slavery.
yeah, it's very much like how God created everyone perfectly. However, you have to cut off a piece of your reproductive organs in order to please God because he didn't create you perfectly, I guess.
Yeah, you got to read the fine print. That's all.
Yeah.
Number two, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see.
I should have watched this more closely when I was recording it. Holy fucking shit.
Yeah,
The purpose of slavery was to help the poor. Are you fucking kidding me?
I would argue that this is probably the most common, that slavery was a good thing because if somebody was starving or they had no money, no shelter, no place to live, they could sell themselves and kind of get a footing in the world. But I just within 10 seconds of thinking, I'm sure you and anybody watching could immediately come up with a better solution to helping the poor as opposed to selling your body.
Yeah, or your children, as we'll get into
Or your
later.
children. Yeah,
And,
yeah.
Like,
I mean,
just the fact that Alan Parr could write this down on a piece of paper, look at it, see it written there, or not a piece of paper, but digitally, whatever, and go, yeah, that's a good thought, just blows my fucking mind.
I just had a good thought. I mean, how about if somebody is poor, you just feed them If somebody's starving, you just feed them. If somebody needs a house, you give them shelter. I mean, that's already better than forced labor. But I'm no god.
Yeah, it weirdly there's another law that I didn't bother to pull up because it doesn't pertain directly to the practice of slavery, but it's if you come across an escaped slave, you're not to return them to their master. Instead, you're to let them basically camp out wherever the hell they want. Well, if you just do that in the first place, if you come and change it from slave to homeless person, if you come across a homeless person, let them sleep in your barn, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, do something aside from some type of forced labor. And I wish I knew exactly what verse that was about the escaped slave, but I'm almost certain that that's not a Hebrew law. That if a slave escapes from another nation, you're not to re-enslave that slave. I don't think that applies to Hebrew slaves, but I could be wrong about that.
It's possible. And then there's also that translation issue, how Hebrew slaves are differentiated from other kinds of slaves. And to such an extent that some translations refer to Hebrew slaves as servants, even though it's the same concept with additional caveats.
Yeah,
He was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years.
And that's kind of bullshit right there, because one of the chief justifications for antebellum slavery was that the slaves are better off, because here, working as slaves in the United States, A, they get a day off, because good Christians have to go to church. B, they get Christianity, so their souls are saved, which is a thing that would not have necessarily happened in their actual homeland. And C, they're provided for. Sure, they have to work to earn their keep, but they're given clothing, they're given food, they're given a place to sleep, and, you know, beaten when they need it. All these good Christian things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just read the note. It's kind of faded in the background now. It says slavery was the last resort. The first resort was for the community to help the poor. But have you ever heard this backed up by anything? This is the first time I've heard that the first resort over slavery was for the community to help the poor.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, we're in Old Testament here, so
yeah, that's an exegesis. That's him reading into the text. There are passages in Exodus where it talks about different things you can do. If you're super broke, you can sell off some of your possessions or some of your property. And then later on, if you do better, you can buy them back. Like there's biblical law governing how you can buy back stuff once you're back on your feet. Okay. Or your relatives can buy your stuff back for you. It's almost like an internal pawn shop system.
Yeah.
But there's no correlation between that in the slavery system. There is no single passage that says do this first, and if all else fails, start selling children.
I didn't think so, but maybe I was wrong about that.
Yeah.
Start selling children, yeah.
Yep.
Jesus.
This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional.
And that is absolutely fucking false.
Yeah, there's a lot of these little slippery words that many apologists use, almost always, but then they never talk about the not almost always. He just said primarily, but he will never touch on so that's primary. Let's just we can give it to him. Let's say it is primarily, it's done this way, but what about when it isn't done that way? They will never touch on it.
Primarily, because the Bible talks about a number of instances of slaves being captured from like prisoners of war and stuff. And here's a passage from Leviticus 25, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. You can be ruthless with these guys because they're not they're not the chosen people or anything. So, how clearly this volitional nonsense is completely false. It only applies to the Hebrew slaves, and even then there were limits. For
Yes.
instance, shoot, where'd I put the passage? Oh, here it is. Exodus 21:7. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. Redeemed is the term they throw around when you want to buy back your property, or a relative buys back your property. So, women are just straight up property, but nonetheless, if a man sells his daughter, the man has no right to sell her to foreigners because he's broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, again, she gets no choice in the matter. She is property. He must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of food, clothing, and marital rights. He was saying, what about polygamy earlier? Because we're starting to touch on the Bible talking about what happens when you have multiple wives. And then there's the whole King Solomon thing. We won't even get started on that. That's a whole other topic. It's just...
I'm curious. So if this is a way to primarily help the poor, does that passage, I don't have that pulled up, does that end with that if the son and the slave doesn't work out, she's free to go? He can't, like, take her back?
At the very end, it's verse 11. If he does not provide, the man who buys her, if he does not provide her with these three things, the food and clothing and marital rights, then she is to go free without any payment of money.
So she has to go. So this is a system that's developed to help the poor. So a father can't feed his daughter, so he sells her to another person. That person isn't happy. He's not pleasing the master, or she's not pleasing the master, so he gives them to his son. And if the son thing doesn't work out and he no longer wants to feed her, the thing that they were trying to do in the first place, she's back to square one with no food, clothing, shelter. She's just free to go back into her life of poverty. Something about that system doesn't seem like it's quite right.
Oh, yeah, it gets better. Like, he does get to keep her until he deprives her of food, clothing, or marital rights, any one of the three. So he could keep her till she's, 35 or something, trade in for another 15-year-old or what have you, and just stop sleeping with her. And now he hasn't broken any laws. She's free to go if she wants, but...
back into her life of starvation and poverty.
Yeah, with no payment whatsoever.
It's a wonderful system to help the poor.
Absolutely. That's how every civilization should do things.
In other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves, or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt.
And that is fractionally true. But again, we just talked about the selling of children. So it's not volitional. It's if you sell yourself to pay a debt, that's probably not really moral either, but at least a case can be made. But if you start selling people who don't have a say in the matter to other people, I don't see how the hell you can make a case that that's moral, even if it helps the poor.
Yeah, and I would argue that, first off, the fact that he could write in big, bold, red letters, sell themselves, is beyond me. Like, did he not read that out loud? Like, you're selling, like you're a human being and you're being sold like your property, even if you are selling yourself.
Dude is so deep in his own bullshit. He's not even seeing what the hell is going on.
He must not.
Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional, which leads...
Okay, so he threw some text on screen, but he skipped right over it. He didn't actually talk about it.
Yeah, he did that on the last one, too.
Yeah, I was waiting for him to say something, so let's go back a second. This is actually, it needs to be talked about. Exodus 21, 5, and 6. That is, okay, so a little bit of context. We have to start a little bit further up.
Just like the apologists, never take a Bible verse out of context. So yes, please give the context to this absolutely monstrous verse that he just put up on his screen.
Yeah, so chapter 21 starts with, this is God saying to Moses, these are the laws you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go in with him. However, If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, remember, we can buy women from other people and just assign them husbands. If the master gives him a wife and she bears him children, the woman and the children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. So if you have children while you're a slave, they stay slaves, period. And then we come to the passage he selected. If the servant declares, when it's time for him to go free, I love my master and my wife and my children, and I don't want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost, and pierce his ear with an awl, and then he will be his servant for life. So the overall of this passage is, even if you're a voluntary servant, you get to go free after 6 years. But if your master tricks you into having a family, he can make you forsake your freedom and become a slave for life. So the fact that Alan Parr brings that up is like a good thing, when that is the freaking way to trick someone into being a slave for life. Oh, but it's only voluntary, it's only a few years. Get the fuck out of here with that shit.
Yeah. I think this is just a way, so he's not trying to convince an atheist or a non-Christian that slavery in the Bible wasn't so bad. What he's trying to do here is convince Christians who want arguments to offer. He's trying to convince them, and he's setting them up for complete failure, because the Christians who hear this argument are going to go to their atheist brother or whatever, and they're going to use this verse, because nobody reads the Bible. No, you know what I mean? They don't know the verses that came before this, and they're going to bring this verse up because it sounded really good to them. And then they're going to get crapped on because they didn't read the verses that came prior to it to set this verse up that on its face might sound like it's a good thing. Like, why would he love his master? Well, he must be treating him well if he's loving him, or it's because his family is being held hostage. One of the two.
You know, minor details.
Very minor details, yes.
Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional, which leads me to my fourth point, which is that kidnapping, according to Exodus chapter 21, in any and all circumstances was completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And
so that doesn't have anything to do with the price of tea in China, as my grandmother used to say. A lot of people like to point to that because they have this idea in their head, and the apologists are always so quick to say, early Hebrew slavery is nothing like the slavery in the antebellum U.S. And then they point to this verse and say, see, you couldn't kidnap people from Africa and bring them across the Atlantic because under rabbinic law, those people would be put to death. But that's not what we're talking about. It has nothing to do with Hebrew slavery. That's all, you know, buying and selling yourself, or buying and selling your children, or getting permanent slaves from the people from the nations around you, like we talked about earlier. There is no kidnapping involved. In fact, that particular verse, what the hell was it? Exodus, let me pull it back up here. 21:16. I'm going to hope his thing is correct. Okay. Here we go. Exodus 21:16. If anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So they like to say, oh, if you kidnap somebody and sell them, you're to be put to death. No. This is saying, if you steal someone, you take them without their volition to somewhere else, it doesn't matter if you sell them as a slave or they're still in your possession. So, in actuality, this law would keep someone from freeing slaves, because if you go kidnap a bunch of slaves and bring them somewhere where they will be free, you're in violation of this law. So it means exactly the opposite of what Alan Parr says it does.
Yeah, and also I like to point out, because this is also very common that apologists use, as far as I'm concerned, and I suppose if you get super like scholarly about it, there's other arguments, but as a layman, when I read Exodus and it says these are the laws you are to set before them, and the them in that is Hebrews, I would read this as only a law to protect Hebrews from, this is, it helps God's people not to be kidnapped. As far as I'm concerned, that doesn't apply to other nations. That's how I read it.
It's quite possible. I don't know that it can necessarily, because, we're dealing with translations upon translations by the time it gets to this. But it would not surprise me, because many cultures had different terms for the people as in us, our tribe, our culture, and the people as in all people, or more precisely, the other people. And since English doesn't have that distinction, we may not be seeing that differentiation. I really can't say.
Yeah. I mean, it says these are the laws you are to give to Hebrew slaves, and then it lists all of the things in Exodus 20, whatever the verses are. And then in other chapters of the book, it gives other rules, and it does distinguish, like the buying the slaves from the nations around you. Those are separate from the Exodus ones that open up with these are the laws you are to give to your Hebrew people. I could be wrong, but that's another huge issue with the Bible, right? Because I read it one way, as we're both atheists, I read it one way, you as an atheist read it a different way, and then the 47,000 different Christians who read it all in different ways. It just, it definitely points to some minor discrepancies written by an all-powerful God.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that all the laws are just it's almost like somebody wrote them down on note cards and then shuffled the note cards, because they're random and they're scattered all over the books. Like, you have to go to Leviticus to check on this part, and then Exodus to check on this other part that relates to the first part. This is why the old school monks made codexes and correspondences, so you could see which verses related to other verses elsewhere in this mangled mess of parchment and shit.
Yeah.
And this part in Leviticus, just before your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you, verse 39 says, if any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. That's where the idea of the servants comes from. Even though they're owned, they're bought and sold, don't make them work as if they were slaves. They're to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee, which is different from what Exodus says about working for 6 years, but okay. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. There's other passages that relate to this about how every one of the chosen people is already a slave of God. They are already owned, so you're only leasing them. So you can't be ruthless because God owns them, not you. But that's where we get the very next verse, is to buy your actual slaves from the nations around you.
Yes.
And it's
yeah.
The relevance there is that you have to cross-check all over the damn place, and that's where people get this idea that even though people are bought and sold as Hebrews, they're not fully slaves in the way we normally think of it. But to me, when a person is property and can be bought, sold, transferred, etc., or beaten at the discretion of their master, that makes them a slave, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, that's the only question that I care about. Whether they were treated like demigods, the slaves. Even if they were treated, I mean, they were worshipped every day. The only question that I would have is, were they free to leave? Were they free to make their own choices? If the answer is no, then it's slavery and it's disgusting.
Okay. To answer our earlier question, Beamsy says, in both Hebrew and Greek, there's a clear difference between the people of the covenant and the others. It's only English where that gets confused, and because English doesn't distinguish people or people, regardless if they're our tribe or another tribe. So that's good to know. It settles that question.
Completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And so this idea that you could take somebody against their...
See, he's changed the question.
Yes.
In the beginning of the video, less than 2 minutes ago, He says atheists say the Bible supports slavery. Now he says this refutes the atheist claim that the Bible supported American slavery.
Yes, correct. Yeah. Even if it was 100% completely different, fine. Okay, fine. It was nothing like American slavery. I think it was very similar in many ways, but I can concede the argument. Fine. Yes, it was nothing like that, but was it good? And the answer is of course no. It still was pretty awful.
Yeah, even if it's not the same. Is it moral? By
Yes.
definition, it has to be, because it's in the book that the morally perfect being dictated. In fact, that particular section he wrote himself, according to tradition. Therefore, it must be morally okay. But it's not, and so he's not. I mean, that's just one of the many, many pieces that shows he's not, but it's a clear contradiction.
Yeah, I don't know who hears that, and who hears the argument that biblical slavery was nothing like American slavery, and then they're just like, oh, okay, and just move on. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a good argument. Yeah, as long as it wasn't like that, but it was.
Yeah, it's like the muggers in New York City. They're a higher class of mugger. You know, in San Francisco, they may knife you in the kidney just for your wallet, but in New York City, they have the courtesy to shoot you in the head before they steal your sneakers. So, you know, there's nothing wrong with that then.
Yeah.
Their will and make them your slave was not only against the law, but it was outside of the will of God. Number 5, slavery was limited to just 6 years, and so the idea here...
And we already covered how that's expressly not true. It's not all slaves, he's got capitalized. No, the Hebrew slaves. In fact, the Hebrew servants, if you want to draw that distinction, only they were freed after 6 years, and only if their masters didn't trick them into signing on for life. And then there's that contradictory passage about the year of Jubilee thing. So, you know.
Yeah.
Is that it was never God's heart for the rich to overtake or control the poor. On the contrary, this system was set up so that slaves or people who were in debt could work off their debt in a safe and loving environment, and then after...
Yes, sell your daughter to a rich man,
Yes.
and if he doesn't take her to wife, he might give her to his son, or possibly to one of his slaves. And if she has children, then she and the children are the master's property for life. But, you know, it's fine.
Yeah, personally, I cannot think of a better family value than what you just described. That seems like it should be the way things are done. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very biblical, traditional way to keep families together. Divorce is not only not allowed, it's not even an option, because you're the property of someone else, so you don't really get a say in the matter.
Yeah, it's all good.
For 6 years, they were not only to go free, but also the master was commanded as an act of kindness to put something in their hands and send them on their way, which was in direct contrast to what has been practiced in our country.
So that does have nothing to do with what happened in the antebellum South, but that's also not true. Like, that verse is a thing. Shoot, I don't have Deuteronomy in my tabs, but we saw in that passage in Leviticus that it says they're to go free with no payment exchanged either way. In this case, Deuteronomy, not directly connected to that part in Exodus where it says they're free to go after 6 years. It talks about giving them goodies and whatnot. But even if they get presents at the end, they're still someone else's property who has the right to beat them just short of death. At whim. To me, you know, getting a picnic basket full of treats at the end of 6 years, it's not a fair trade.
Yeah, and realistically, it just doesn't matter. No matter what kind of severance package you get at the end of it, no matter the length of it, again, I always fall back to just was that person free to make their own choices? And if the answer is no, then all of the other stuff it can be better or worse, but it's still slavery.
Yeah, I
at
mean,
the end of it.
if this is such a great system for work and compensation and helping people out, why don't we practice it today?
Interesting, yeah. Yeah.
Because no one would stand for it. Like,
No.
people are not happy with the current system of jobs and capitalism and whatnot, but at least you can quit. I mean, you may, for financial
Right.
reasons, be stuck in a job you hate, but from a legal standpoint, you can quit and you can
Yes,
just
you are
go
free
home.
to go.
Yes.
Yes.
Under this system, you cannot. So if you offer people the choice to become a servant under the terms of the Pentateuch, the Old Testament, Exodus and Deuteronomy, I have yet to hear of a single person who says, oh, yes, I would love to do that. That would be a wonderful thing.
Right, right. And realistically, how much of a choice is it when your choices are become a slave or starve to death? I mean, how much choice do you? I suppose you could choose starve to death, but I wouldn't consider that voluntary. If you're selling yourself to not starve to death, I don't think that's a voluntary system. You're trying to not literally die.
ER. In fact, if you ever reach that point, that's kind of a symptom that your civilization has failed.
You know what? That's actually really good. Why was God's chosen people reaching the point where they had to sell themselves in order just to simply eat food? I never thought of that.
Yeah. I mean, from a sociological standpoint, the success of a civilization is how effectively it enhances the quality of life of its citizens. The whole point is to facilitate reproduction. It's the whole it's a social construct version of evolution. A society that can do that job better, to make quality of life better and help produce more future citizens superior to an existing civilization, will overtake the existing civilization every single time. If your civilization isn't making that possible because people are homeless and starving in the streets,
There might be some problems.
things are not boding well. Because, again, from a sociological standpoint, you can picture a civilization as if it were an organism with each individual member of that society as the cells or tissues or organs or whatever. And the more cells are in a bad state, they're sick, they're not able to function, however you want to mentally picture it, the less effective the overall organism is, the sicker it becomes.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. I like that.
Yeah.
Number 6, slave owners were to treat slaves with respect. The Bible.
Yes. Let's go back to Exodus. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished only if the slave dies as a direct result. But they're not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property.
Yes. I mean, somebody in my comment section pointed out that the fact that they were slaves is inherently disrespectful. And I really like that. I never really thought of it that way. Just simply being the slave kind of prohibits any type of respect that can be garnered from a slave-master relationship. You're a slave. You've already been disrespected.
Yeah, like your humanity has already been degraded.
Yeah, Mm-hmm.
I'm being terrible about keeping up with the side chat again, but Beamsy caught my attention. Family values we were discussing moments ago. What about the family value that if you force yourself on an unpromised maiden, you just need to pay her father 20 shekels and then she is yours for life?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Bear Air says that maybe 40 shekels.
It's
whatever.
an important distinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
20,
yeah.
40. Yeah.
But I mean, it just morality. Who needs it, right?
Who needs it? Yes, not the
Yeah.
Bible. That's for sure.
Yeah, and also welcome to membership, Bearer. It's glad to have you on board. I think we need one more, and then we can add another emoji. Now, a brief shilling aside for a moment. I was super excited about getting custom emojis for this channel for all the people who join memberships. It's the most minor of perks, but it's a perk I was really looking forward to offering. Turns out you can only offer a number of custom emojis based on the number of members. And the next slot unlocks at 10 members total, but whatever. So I made it one of the perks that when we reach enough members that we can add another emoji. When the slot opens up, members get to vote on what the next emoji is. So, you know, it's a minor thing, but
yeah, no,
I
it's
think
fun. I like doing it. Yeah, it is fun.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah. All right. Enough shilling for the moment.
Says in Leviticus chapter 25 that slave owners were commanded to treat slaves as employees or hired workers in terms of the type of work that they gave them.
And we already covered that part. That's Hebrews only. It makes a distinction. Anybody who's not an Israeli doesn't get that protection.
Yeah, again, even if they did, it just doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you're not free to make your own choices as a autonomous being, then it's wrong.
Yeah, because you're not just selling your services; you're selling your freedom, and that's the thing that I think most people consider non-negotiable.
Yeah, yeah.
Not only this, but if a slave owner was guilty of killing a slave, he would be facing severe punishment himself.
Yes, if you murder someone, you will be punished. Now notice this is a passage from Leviticus, right? That whole no wait, the beating them with a stick is Exodus. Yes.
Yeah.
Beats her slave with a rod. First of all, only with a rod. If you physically punch them, it's not even an issue. But whatever. If you beat them with a rod and they die, then you are to be punished. But this is the same book where half of these other laws, like anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. If anyone curses their father or mother, they're to be put to death. Yes. But if you murder your slave, you're to be punished. So this is like the one law that doesn't require death if you break it.
Right. Yeah, because they're slaves. Like if they try to make the argument that, like he just said, that they're to be treated as almost like equals, like they're still your brethren, but they're just not. There's definitely a clear distinction between slaves and free people, as you just read. Like, why would you not? Why would the punishment be so much less than simply, what did it say, cursing or disrespecting your mother and father? That seems like that does not seem like something that should be punishable by death. But for some reason, the Bible holds up mothers and fathers in a very high regard.
Yeah, that's well. I think that it's speculation, but there seems to be this whole complex of obey, obey, obey all the way through the Old Testament. In fact, God expressly says that from time to time at random. Obey, for I am the Lord your God. Fear me, for I am the Lord your God. All these things.
Third of all, they were commanded to maintain the family unity. And so if a slave came to you and he was already married with children.
So this is completely misleading too. If he comes with the wife, then she is to go with him. The master doesn't get to keep the wife of a slave because the wife is the slave's property. This is a fun thing about slavery in the time. It isn't just the Israelis. The Persians did this too. You could be a slave and still own property, including other slaves.
Yeah, and I hear the argument a lot that this was a way to like better slave. I'm glad you brought up like the Persians and stuff, because I did a little bit of digging around, and like the Greek culture, there was already like philosophers and stuff who were way more advanced than the Middle Eastern culture at the time. And they were already calling for the complete abolition of slavery. And I guess I'm glad you brought up the Persian things, because this wasn't the worst form of slavery that you could possibly imagine in your head, but it also wasn't as good as some other slaves in other cultures had it at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of our apologists may bring it up later, so I'll talk about it later. But sure. The Persian slavery system isn't as bad as the Israeli system. There's considerable pluses to being a slave in Persia as opposed to being a slave in Israel. So, actually, I talk about it in a video that I've got coming up. Ben Shapiro makes the case that the slavery in Israel was a step up. It was progress towards abolition compared to what the other cultures around were doing.
Very common, yeah.
that's completely not true.
Very common, yes.
Because as you just mentioned, there were Greek city-states that were talking abolition already at this point, and in Persia, not only was the slavery frowned upon, but there were much stricter limits about what you could do with and to a slave. Like, you can't take his property away, even if it's other slaves, and slaves had to be paid. They weren't just clothed and fed; they had to be paid.
It's almost like these rules were written by people living in their own time, and not by a god who would know past, present, and future. It's almost like that.
Weird, right?
Very strange. Very strange.
Children, after the 6 years were up, he and his wife and his children were to go free, which was in direct contrast to what was happening in our country. Finally, God made it very clear.
Yes, it's true that in American antebellum slavery, you could sell a slave to another slave owner, or anybody else, really, it's up to you, and if they were married, you could keep the wife, or you could sell the wife and keep the slave, or whatever. You could sell off the children. It is another step down from the Israeli system, but that doesn't make the Israeli system good.
Yes, not as bad does not equal good.
Yar. I do have to thank Alan for bringing up this verse I was talking about earlier. The Israelis should be treated as servants because they belong to Yahweh. They are his property.
Yeah,
So
but
that's
is there
Leviticus 25.
in the Old Testament, is there a similar verse for non-Israelites?
I can't think of one. That doesn't mean there isn't one, but
I'm very confident that there is not. I'm very confident.
That a master was buying simply the services and not the servant, because it's very clear that no man can own another man like they can own an animal, because all of us were created in the image of God, and all of us belong to God as servants.
and that's not actually true.
No.
And this whole equal rights business, absolutely not. Could own property, that's not expressly stated one way or another. I can imagine a world where a slave was allowed to own his own home, but if you're that, like, if you are so destitute you had to sell yourself or start selling your children off or whatever, I can't imagine you'd own much property and still reach that state, but okay.
Yeah.
And then the purchase their freedom thing, again, all of that only applies to the Israeli slaves.
Yes, you're exactly right. Yeah, it's did he just, I missed it. Did he read these off? He didn't read them off, right? He just put them on the background to kind of...
Yeah, these ones are just assertions.
Okay, I'm curious. What is this guy's name? Alan
Parr. Apparently
okay.
he used to be an actor back in the day.
All right, I'm gonna look into it, because I wonder if this is a common theme of his, where he will put really, really good things, because what he's saying out loud isn't. I mean, if somebody's watching a YouTube video, you're probably focused on him, what he's saying, and reading the background as an afterthought. But I notice he's been putting really good things, like slaves had equal rights and they could get freedom and they could own property, and the other stuff that he's had in the background. But he's not saying those things, and I'm curious if that's a theme of his. A sneaky little tactic.
Yeah, like how much of it is exegesis on his part, but even that last line, that could purchase their freedom, that really answers the question right there. They don't have their freedom.
They don't. Yes.
If you have to buy it, you don't already have it.
Mm-hmm.
To God as servants. And number 7, slavery was never based on race.
This is technically true.
Yeah.
But who asked?
That's exactly right. It's just like the what was it, his number 1 or number 2 or whatever, where he said that God did not create slavery. It's like, all right, that is true, but literally nobody cares. Nobody says that. That's not an argument that people are making. That's not... There should be no reason for him to put this on the screen right now, because he's defending against an invisible person. Nobody makes this argument. I've never once heard this argument made that biblical slavery was based on race or skin color. I've never once heard anybody ever say this. I don't know why well, I do know why. They defend against it because it's true. So this is a true thing that they can say. It's a very little of a true thing that they can say, but I think that's why they push so hard, because they can actually back it up.
Yeah, it's another instance of this isn't as bad as some alternatives, therefore it's good by comparison, or something. Exactly. And it's a tough one because it only makes sense when you compare it to antebellum slavery in the U.S. But while race and racism were a huge component of that, American slavery was never restricted to race either. There were free black people, there were Native Americans and Chinese who were both slaves and slave owners. Everyone could own slaves, and everyone except Europeans could be slaves. So it was kind of equal opportunity moral abominations.
Yeah, that's good. Equal opportunity.
And so nowhere in the Bible does it condone enslaving a race of people, rather only individuals, and that on a voluntary basis.
And that's also bullshit.
Yes. Yes.
While nobody's enslaved by race per se, it is entire populations, or more precisely, the survivors of the populations after the Israeli armies destroy their city.
Yeah, I mean, this would be similar to like World War II, Germany and England. Let's just say that the Germans had won and they enslaved all of the British, and you would make the argument, well, it wasn't race based because the vast majority of the cultures are white. Like, well, okay, that's true. It's not based on the fact that their skin color is different, but you're still owning other human beings as property.
Yeah, and we do see something very similar in the Bible with all the various cities that get destroyed, that get genocided. There are rules about what to do with war captives, even civilians, non-combatants. Like, infamously, there's the Midianites, where the instruction from God was to kill everyone but the virgin girls, and then keep the virgin girls for yourselves, wink, wink.
Yes.
But
yeah, and that verse is another one that apologists give apologetics to just as commonly as slavery, and it's so unambiguous, clearly stated that they were to go and annihilate the entire civilization. But somehow, just like slavery, they will still come up with ways to be like, well, it wasn't so bad.
Yeah, it wasn't like they were Hitler or anything. They let some people live.
Yeah, it's
and then there's other cities that get wiped out, and survivors are made slaves for life. There's other cities where I can't think of the passage off the top of my head, but where the Israeli army shows up and the people throw open their gates and surrender, and they're still made slaves for life.
Yeah, it gets really bad. But you know, funnily enough, those types of slavery, these apologists will never talk about. He will pick verses from like Deuteronomy and Leviticus 1 or 2, but primarily they only speak to Hebrew slavery or servitude, whatever you want to call it. They'll only speak to that, and they will never mention the other forms of absolute, like, chattel slavery, or these, like you just said, the war slaves. They will never speak of those.
Yeah, we're just gonna skip over it. Now we're gonna give you just enough so you can feel better about believing in this immoral horror, and say it's good. You can go home and sleep easy tonight. We're not going to discuss the rest.
Yeah.
Does the Bible make concessions for and have laws that regulate and ensure the proper treatment of slaves? I would have to say yes. But does it support the degradation or the mistreatment of slaves that we saw in our country for nearly 400 years? Absolutely not. If you found this video helpful,
would you be able to rewind just 10 seconds
Yeah.
Did he just say yes? The Bible does support. I mean, he put some flowery language on it, but did he say yes? The Bible does support slavery.
I very much like that. Yeah.
Support the
Oh, a little further.
treatment of slaves, I would have to say,
No, that a little further still.
Oh man, yeah, I'm so bad at rewinding.
sure, the proper treatment of slaves, I would have to say yes. But the
Man.
Bible make concessions for and have law
Okay.
basis. So does the Bible make concessions for and have laws that regulate and ensure the proper treatment of slaves? I would have to say yes. But does it support the
There you
But-
go. Okay.
But
Yeah, I mean, he has the but I think that might possibly be the first time I've heard an apologist say, yes, the Bible does support slavery. And sure, it supports the proper treatment of slaves and whatever else he just said, but he's conceded the argument that, yes, the Bible does support slavery.
yeah, he's still trying to turn the question into, is the slavery the same as U.S. slavery? It's not, and no one says it is. But yeah, I had a friend in high school whose dad was he was a very gruff Vietnam vet type person, and he had a saying. Whenever you were trying to explain something, particularly if you needed to make an excuse, like, you know, he'd say, David, why haven't you given the horses their hay or whatever? And David would say, oh, well, I meant to do it, but, you know, Grandma fell down the stairs. He'd stop him. He'd be like, no buts, no buts. Do you know what comes after a butt? Shit. It's as soon as you mention a butt, everything after that is shit. I don't want to hear it.
Yeah. Just like, I agree, but, well, if you had a but, then you didn't agree. Yeah. No,
Yeah. All right. We are done with this dude. Let's go on to Mike Winger. We're probably not going to do all of his thing because he's going to make his key points in the first couple of minutes. Yeah, we'll see
I
how it
just
goes.
realized we burned up a whole hour on that 4-minute video. Good. Jeez.
The good news is, though, we've already referenced most of the scripture, so it should go faster from here.
Yeah. I'll try to stop talking so much. Let's go.
Oh, it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, I don't know why his video, I recorded it on the other computer, so it's 1080p, but I don't know why it doesn't fill the window. It's whatever.
Well,
Yeah.
how did slavery exist typically in Israel back in the day? It was actually an indentured servitude. It was less than a slavery, like you are kidnapped and brought over and you're put into service. Rather, it was more of an indentured servitude or a work for a contract period of time.
So, yeah, Mike Winger, of course, is like the apologist. He starts with a lie and then stacks lies on top of it, a la Frank Turek, except not quite as quick on his toes.
Yeah, I've noticed, I've done a number of Mike Winger's videos, and I noticed he's one that uses it's not good. I'm not giving him any credit here. This is a despairing comment, but he's very clever in the way that he tries to use slippery language. I'll try to point it out if he does, but I just want to point out his face. He came in with such confidence in his opening statement. He's like, so what is actually the biblical slavery? Well, actually, biblical slavery was this. And then he gives this face that you paused on. It's almost like he's looking out at the crowd like, did anybody just buy any of that I just said?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I'm gathering from that.
Because he immediately changed the subject from what everyone agrees is slavery in the Bible to what people on his side like to say, well, it's more like, you know, a servant kind. It's like a work for hire. It's like a contract, really. It's, you know, you're a salaried employee almost with an executive office or something. You know, it's
a
fine.
nice ocean view. Sure.
Yeah.
It really was. It was a contracted period of time. It was
really was.
voluntary. Rather than starving, I would say, hook myself up with someone who had the money. I would say, I will serve you for X number of years if you provide for me housing and clothing and perhaps a wage above and beyond that.
Perhaps a wage. How generous.
See, there you go. It's what I said in the very beginning. He's almost clever at using slippery language. Perhaps he'll throw that in. Perhaps, maybe, kind of, sort of, and then, but he's asserting it as if they were to get a wage. But he throws in those little modifiers. Perhaps.
Yeah, and he's already done. Of course, he's not the only apologist who does this.
No,
but he's
no.
already shifted the conversation entirely onto just the Israeli slaves. We're
Yes.
completely ignoring the actual slaves, the buy your slaves from the nations around you.
Yes.
We're not going to pay any attention to that at all. And we're not going to pay any attention to the involuntary indenture of Israeli persons, such as when I'm starving, so I start selling my children to other people. How the hell is that voluntary?
Yes, at least for the children. Or
So.
does it does it mention anything about selling your son? I think I've mentioned this in a previous video of mine that it, like, why weren't you able to, if you couldn't afford your son, why weren't you allowed to sell your son into slavery? It does specifically say you may sell your daughter into slavery. I find that just a little bit gross.
There's a couple places where it mentions selling your son, but it's not nearly as popular as selling your daughter.
Well, yeah, and that's gross. We can only imagine why.
You can think of Jacob and Laban as being an example of this. Jacob leaves, Esau's chasing him, he's got nothing, just the clothes on his back, basically. He finds Laban, he ends up coming into a 7-year contract with him. 7 years was the maximum, right? And then so he gets into
And, 7 years is not the maximum by any
Correct,
stretch of the
yes.
imagination. Like that whole section in, where is it, Leviticus? I've got too many freaking verses. Yeah, Leviticus is all on about this year of Jubilee business.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't say anything about 7 years. There's, where is the Israeli part of this?
I believe
Yeah,
it's
verse
50?
39-ish. Okay, here it is. Verse 40. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you, and they are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Nothing about 7 years. If the year of Jubilee was last year, they're yours for 49 years.
Yeah, I would almost argue, of course, with some exceptions, that 7 years is probably the minimum, not the maximum.
I think you're probably correct. I don't recall seeing anything anywhere about a term shorter than that. Nor is there really room to negotiate, because this is God's law handed down to Moses. You don't negotiate, you just do what God says.
Yeah, and plus, as a slave, I'm not sure how much negotiating power you hold as a slave.
Yeah. So it's like, standard 7-year contract, with the 7th year being the year you go free.
Sort of.
Sort of.
Kind
yes.
of.
With terms and exclusions apply. Not
Perhaps.
valid in all 50 states.
Yeah.
7-year contract with him, and then he gets his pay changes. And Laban was a bad owner; he would have been rebuked under the Old Testament law. But
And the slave had no say in the matter.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why he would bring up a verse to defend biblical slavery, and then I don't know the story that he's referencing, but why would you bring that story up and then be like, well, actually, he was a kind of a terrible owner? But you know what I mean? Like, why bring that up as a defense in your argument? Then just admit that, yeah, he also wasn't a good slave owner. Under biblical law, he was not a good slave owner.
Yeah, but, okay, he would be rebuked, whatever, but he can still murder you, and he only gets punished.
there's an example of how somebody moved into that position. It was caused by poverty, not racial status.
And again, nobody brought up race. Yes,
Nobody
I
wants
understand
ever.
it's different from U.S. slavery, but nobody brought that up. What the hell, man?
Yes, it's like they have to convince themselves. The only people who make this argument are Christians, are apologists. No, nobody else makes this argument. It's like they're trying to just comfort themselves on this. Like, oh, okay, well, at least it wasn't race based.
Yeah, it's like, they're constantly invoking that passage from Romans about how you have to be prepared to make a defense. They're thinking to themselves, this is really horrible. How can I possibly justify this? Because it's my duty as an apologist to defend this position. So they know. Deep inside their own
Yeah.
brains, they
Yeah.
know. And they're...
It's as if they were to go to like their atheist uncle or whatever, and they dropped this apologetic. They're like, well, actually, biblical slavery wasn't race based, and then the atheist uncle is like, yeah, okay, I agree with that, and then that's it. There's no more discussion to be had.
Yeah, well, look at it another way. Like, the fact he's just bringing this up as if again, as if it makes it any better, but another analogy would be like you go to Thanksgiving, and of course relatives aren't supposed to discuss politics at the table, but someone inevitably does. And so you're sitting there, and your cousin Fred just out of nowhere is like, well, American slavery wasn't so bad, really, because the slaves got to be Christians, they got fed, it wasn't really that bad. Like, who the hell? Everyone is gonna like shove away from this dude. They'll be like, what's wrong with you?
Yes.
Why are you trying to make excuses for this horrible thing?
Right, yeah.
But when it's Christianity, oh, he's a good and righteous, upright individual. He's defending God, and that's noble, or something.
You see, or something.
Mm-hmm.
It was not caused by racial status, but by poverty. There was
By poverty, or because, or war, or because a person is a foreigner, or because your father decided, or...
Right. Well, yeah, and you're exactly right. Because your father decided. I mean, so I can understand the argument that it was a way, speaking strictly of Exodus, that it was a way to kind of keep yourself from starving to death. But it doesn't necessarily say that. Why would... Okay, let's say that there was a father who just wanted to sell his daughter. He just simply, maybe he just wanted to make a profit, or maybe he just simply didn't want her anymore. So he can just get rid of her.
Yeah, he doesn't have to be starving. It's
Right,
still
exactly.
one more mouth to feed situation,
Yeah. Yeah. So I get that you can make the argument that it was a form of indentured servitude, but it doesn't say that.
Yeah, so that's another instance of reading into the text. That's exegesis. And if you try that on apologists, they will immediately call it out and be like, oh, that's a fallacy, you can't do that. But when they do it, it's fine.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
There's no rape involved in God's regulations of slavery. Firstly, because rape was punishable by death, and you had the same law for the slave as you did for the free.
And that's... Okay, first of all, that has nothing to do with slavery, and we're going to move on from him because that word is one of those naughty words that gets streams taken down.
Oh,
But that's not what the Bible says anyway. If you do that thing, you have to pay a small fine to your victim's father.
In some cases. So in some cases, yes, you are to be put to death. But it's all based off of, I don't want to say any trigger words here, but it's all based off of your experience. So if you don't have any, as strictly as a female, if you don't have any sexual experience, there's different laws because the Bible holds pure, I guess, I don't know. It holds pure
the whole
women
purity
as such
thing.
a higher standard. So if you are, oh boy, what was it? There's like 4 different situations that they describe based off of whether you are to be married or if you are not, and based off if you are if you are pure or not.
Yeah, and if you cry for help or not.
Yeah. So if you are engaged, and you force yourself, in those situations, you can be put to death. Yeah, but if you are not engaged, and you are not if you're not pure, I hate saying that. I just want everybody to know I hate saying that. It's a terrible way to describe that. I'm trying to be respectful of the stream. I hope everybody knows what I mean. If you are not pure, that's when you just pay a fine because that lady was already useless.
Yeah. Okay, so this fellow, I forget where the hell he's from. When I saved his stream, or his video, it was just... I just labeled it as slavery good, because that's pretty much what he says.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was looking for at the time, and I'm like... So I forget where the hell he's from. But,
I did a video. I actually covered this video. This is the only one, maybe Mike, I don't remember. But I actually did. So this guy is the only apologist I've heard yet that mentions other types of slavery in the Bible. He mentions it like I think it's like one sentence, And then he says, and I'm going to follow up on these videos, or he says something to that effect. We're going to talk about that other types of slavery. And I went to his channel and I scrolled through every single one of his videos, and he just lied about that. He never followed up on any, not surprisingly, but he never followed up. But at least I will give him credit. At least he does mention it.
Well, it's something anyway. And it's also possible he did make the videos and then later took them down for whatever reason.
This is true.
It does happen quite a lot. As longtime fans of the channel know, there's a particular obnoxious evangelical we check in with from time to time, and he's had to take a couple of videos down because he broke too big a law on video or whatever the case may be. So yeah, it happens for various reasons. Sometimes it's copyright, sometimes it's your fans really don't like it. Like if he's openly talking about other kinds of slavery and no other apologists are, I could definitely see other Christians, flaming his comment section and being like, "How dare you?"
Yeah, I suppose that could be true. Yes, but as far as I could see, there are no videos covering the other forms of slavery. But like I said, he does mention it, so he gets 1 point
to go against all the many minus points he's already got. But details. Yeah. All right, so we probably won't do the whole thing with him either. I just want to get through some of his main points.
Mm-hmm. But as I begin to think about the contemporary relevancy of this subject, 3 groups came to mind. Number 1, atheists who continue to think that the Bible condones slavery and is therefore a significant moral flaw in an omnibenevolent God.
Yeah,
it does. Yeah. With no argument, the Bible does condone slavery. If you take just the Webster's definition, condone, to accept and allow. It 100% condones it. You can make arguments, I guess, that it wasn't a moral good or nobody was commanded to own slaves. They just could do it. Except when they were. But if you want to make these arguments, but you cannot make the argument that at least the Bible, you can't say that the Bible doesn't condone slavery, because it just does. It accepts and allows slavery. There's no question.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this is his intro about why he decided to cover this topic. Atheists saying there's this moral horror in your book that's supposed to be perfectly moral is reason number 1. And, partial credit to him, because yes, that is exactly what I say and exactly why I say that.
Yeah. He's kind of like the argument of the Christian argument, defending slavery in human form. He's not the worst form of apologist. I don't say that it makes him good, but he's not the worst apologist.
So on my channel page and on the website and on Patreon, I've got this cover image with a couple of World War II style plane shot down victory marks on it. And the very first one is an old Cairo symbol, because one of the first people that I shot down so hard they never recovered was an apologist named Jay, and I'm still a little bit sad that I just knocked him right out of the apologist business, because even though his arguments were very basic and his positions were weak, sloppy logic, misleading people, and spreading a horrible message, convincing them to continue to be Christian regardless of all these concerns they may have about what their faith means. Even so, he was a likable guy, and he's probably, despite what I just said, the most honest apologist I've ever come across. And so the fact that he just hung up his preaching spurs, it's kind of a shame. But only kind of, because it is one less person trying to convince people to believe a horrible thing.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Do you still have those? Did you do this online, or these conversations you had with him, or is it?
I didn't converse with him directly. I made 2 response videos, and they're still on my channel.
All right, yeah, I'll check them out.
Yeah, there's some of the older videos, but they're still there. And For better or for worse, they're the only record of this dude ever having been an apologist, because after I posted the second video,
Wow.
he deleted his channel.
Oh my goodness, he wiped him off the face of the internet. Jeez.
Exactly.
All right.
That's why I put that victory mark on my thing. I'm like, I shot this dude down. Now, I don't know for sure it was me, but
Hey, you know what? If nobody knows for sure, then you can just take the W and move on.
yeah, absolutely.
Number two, Christians who are confused by the descriptions and dialogue of slavery in the Bible. And number three,
Yes, Christians who are confused because they read what the book plainly says and think it means what it plainly says.
What
we
is-
have
yeah.
to talk them out of it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
African Americans. You see, we share this unique post-traumatic bond to slavery, so this subject can be of particular interest and concern.
And that's true. I've met a number of African American atheists who deconverted from Christianity after reading the Bible and seeing it endorses slavery, even though people will make the argument, oh, they themselves were never enslaved and yada, yada, yada. The fact of the matter is that African Americans start from a shittier position because of the legacy of slavery. Even though they weren't slaves themselves, their lives are impacted by those old wounds. So
Oh, yeah.
when they see this holy book that they were raised to believe is the best thing ever, talking about how slavery is a good thing, they have every right to throw that book away and say, this is bullshit. In fact, everyone should, but I can definitely empathize with African Americans who feel that way.
Yeah.
Now, the confusion that often concerns slavery in the Bible is primarily due to our conflation of pre-Civil War or antebellum slavery.
No,
Yes, we're just confused.
No, not once ever.
I need a gaslighting emoji.
Yeah, I've never once ever, and I'm only speaking for myself, of course, but I have never conflated the two. When I first started getting into this sphere of atheism and trying to, getting into that community, and I've heard biblical slavery, I've never once thought like, oh my goodness, these people that must have been just like chattel, the transatlantic slave trade. I've never once thought this. I don't know if maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that is common. Maybe when people hear that, they're like, oh my goodness. But I've never thought this. I've never once ever thought that these were the exact same thing. I guess all in all, it doesn't matter, but what is this, the third time we've heard this already? That it's not, you know what I mean?
Yeah, every single one feels the need to
every
bring it up.
single one, yeah,
And
yeah.
I think it's not because people are actually confused. I mean, I'm sure some people are confused because people get confused about everything. I think it's a way to bring up this other thing that they can point at as being worse. It's a red herring, It's like,
Oh, yeah.
don't look at this, look over here. That's really bad, and this isn't that.
Yeah.
You're
You're exactly right. I've never thought this.
And the slavery as described in the Bible. This comparison, which I'll elaborate more on shortly, and our subsequent aversion to it in the Bible, is understandably made due to our familiarity of the abhorrent nature of pre-Civil War slavery.
And that's kind of nationalist of him, I suppose. It's Americans get a lot of shit on the internet because Americans tend to think that America is the only country.
It is true.
People all around the world look at this section of the Bible endorsing slavery and go, this is a moral horror. What the hell? Only Americans make that connection with American slavery because, believe it or not, other countries, they teach their own history. American history, U.S. history is not the number one subject you need to graduate high school in Australia, for example. So,
yes. I would love to go to like Bosnia and quiz them on how much they know about chattel slavery and how much it relates to biblical
man on the
slavery.
street interviews. And while I'm sure, because the United States has been a huge influence on world history in the past couple of, the 20th century for sure, and continuing to be in the 21st century, but you know, in the U.S., where we have the best schools around, except not, we don't learn about slavery in, say, England, which was the power when the United States was founded. We know there was slavery because we get like a one-line mention in our textbooks that they banned slavery before we did. In like 1850, maybe 1820, I don't know, because it wasn't really taught. We know nothing about slavery in other countries because we hyper-focus on our own history and systems and things.
Yeah.
So I think it's helpful to think about this subject from the perspective of the two primary pillars of both of these forms of slavery, the motivation and the treatment. Economics was the motivation for both antebellum slavery and the slavery described in the Bible.
He's not
Wow.
off to a good start here. He's saying they're different, but here's how they're the same.
Yes, exactly. And this is why I say he's not the worst. He's not the worst. Yes, you're exactly right. You just said it. You said it perfectly. Then I can ramble on for 5 minutes. There's how they're different, but also here's how they were the exact same, and then starts making comparisons. But I think he's doing this I think he's being genuine. I don't think he's trying to be, I don't think he's saying that biblical slavery was the best thing ever, like these other apologists are. I think he's being honest and saying, hey, actually there were similarities. So it's just a little bit refreshing that he's not the worst.
Yeah, I'll give him that it's slightly less frustrating.
It's slightly
like
less
Mike Winger.
frustrating. Yes, it's a tiny bit better.
Antebellum slavery concerned colonists desiring free and perpetual labor. This, of course, was achieved through the socially constructed idea of race, and that being this idea that race isn't a biological fact, and subsequently the supposed racial inferiority of African Americans.
So he's mixing up a whole bunch of topics together, and once again, race absolutely was a big factor. The Atlantic slave trade was primarily focused on Africans, but that doesn't, it's not equivalent. It's not the same thing as the racism and the white supremacy. You know, white supremacists at the time believed that while Africans are subhuman, so are Native Americans, so are Asians. Only white people are the best thing ever. And there were Asian slaves, there were Native American slaves, and there were, the Cherokee famously had thousands of slaves. That's why there's still controversy today, because following emancipation, the Cherokee were required to put all their slaves on their tribal rolls as members of the tribe. And then when the Cherokee started opening casinos, they wanted to cut off the tribe members who were not full-blooded, because they were descended from their own former slaves. It's like, way to fuck over the people you fucked over the ancestors for. Yeah. And that was a big controversy. And so, yeah, slave holding and being slaves, it wasn't exclusively a race issue. Race was a huge part, but as a form of justification, not as an actual cause. It was the bullshit people made up to say why it's a good thing, not the actual reason for it. The reason black people were enslaved, Africans were enslaved, was because they were easy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because I know, just trying to think about my history books when I was in school, there was like the auction stable, whatever you want to call it, where they were to do this form of chattel slavery, and where they would go and buy slaves. And then you look at the Bible verses that you just pulled up where it said, you may buy slaves. And then they try to kind of counter that with the whole kidnapping thing. But it's not like, and not to say that it never happened, because of course it did, but it's not like we would go over there with like a war party and just round people up and then load them on the ships. We would go purchase them from Africa because they had already done the capturing, not in all circumstances. But how is that different? So if the Americans go to Africa and purchase slaves from slave traders, and in the Bible you can purchase slaves from nations around you, how is this? This is where I say there's a lot of similarities between biblical slavery and American chattel slavery. Like, how is that any different?
Oh,
You could
yeah.
just go purchase slaves. Like, sure, you couldn't kidnap them, but anyway, I digress.
Yeah, yeah. Once they were already kidnapped, and that was a big thing.
Yeah.
There were other Europeans who set up shops on like Congo and Ivory Coast and just captured all the locals and sold them to the British to bring across the Atlantic as slaves. Or you could go to the other end of Africa, Arabian slave traders. That was, between the eras of the Silk Road and the oil era, selling slaves that had been captured from Africa was the big business in that region as well. It's very disturbing. I mean, of course,
Yeah.
it's disturbing in a lot of different ways.
Yeah,
but
yeah, but it's just so there's so many similarities. Yeah.
All
So
right,
we're only 2
we'll
minutes
go a
in.
little bit further with this guy, but I think we've said just about everything that needs to be said. And I've
Yeah.
got one more thing before we wrap up from the other side of the coin.
The transatlantic slave trade marked the event in which millions of Africans were kidnapped and forcibly brought to the Americas, with millions dying en route. All of these factors and others meant that pre-Civil War slavery was involuntary. But
And now he's going to make the case that Hebrew slavery was voluntary, by contrast, which we've already dealt with the other apologists. For a very select group of Hebrew slaves, that was true. But for the majority of Hebrew slaves, it was not. Just because you
Right.
can point, there was indentured servitude in the United States too. If we only talk about the indentured servitude, the Irish people brought over and had to serve for X number of years to pay for their passage or whatever. If we only talk about that and never mention the millions of Africans who were
Right.
enslaved, then I guess slavery in the U.S. wasn't as bad as
it
people
wasn't
make it out
so
to be
bad.
either.
Nice. Two things. Nice pause, by the way. The face is priceless. Number two. Can we go just a little bit more? I don't want to go too far into this because he does just kind of repeat. But I want to refresh on what exactly he does say when he does mention that there are other forms of slavery.
All right, yeah, we should.
Yeah, we don't gotta go
we'll
too
try
far,
to
but-
try to let him get to that point. And
It's like another 30 seconds
I'll
or
stop
so.
interrupting him every sentence.
slavery in the Bible was quite different. First off, the very Hebrew word that's often translated as slavery in the Bible, or as slave in the Bible, given our modern sensibilities, is more properly rendered as servant. And this would actually make sense given their cultural context. You see, slavery among the Hebrews in the Old Testament typically occurred when individuals sold themselves into servanthood to pay off debt.
Little modifier word there. Typically.
yes.
Yeah,
Like-
typically.
like,
But what about when it wasn't typical?
Yeah, like when Mike Winger said most of, but
Most of.
but
Perhaps,
not
maybe,
not really.
yeah.
Yes, yeah, and as we've already addressed, which is why I didn't
Yes.
interrupt him for those parts.
Yeah.
Not exclusively voluntary, even the part where it's servant instead of slave. Even though the translations that bother to differentiate definitely use the word slave, whatever. We've already talked about those things.
Therefore, it was voluntary. Additionally, the Hebrews actually had laws prohibiting kidnapping, such as in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16.
And once again, not fucking relevant.
Yes. Yes. Completely irrelevant.
And Hebrew slaves or servants were not subjected to that same kind of perpetual bondage like in the case of pre-Civil War slavery.
Or like in the case of non-Hebrew slaves, or Hebrew slaves who were tricked into becoming their master's slave for life.
Shh.
I know
We don't talk about that.
This is why
we
I'm
don't
a
talk
heathen.
about those
I
verses.
could never be a good Christian. I'm just really bad at this.
Their servitude was akin to a contractual agreement where they would be released after 7 years.
Sometimes.
Now, the treatment in both
Ish.
instances was also vastly different. Again, due to this false idea of racial inferiority, enslaved Africans were viewed as subhuman and therefore were treated as chattel or property.
Yeah. This is the difference they like to try to make, but it clearly states, it so very clearly states that you may be purchased, you may be bought, you may be sold. This is chattel slavery. In biblical, speaking of the Bible slavery is chattel slavery, as you're about to point out here.
Yep. The slave is their property. It does not get any clearer than that.
It's so clear. I don't understand it. Biblical slavery is chattel slavery. Is it equivalent to like American pre-Civil War slavery? No, but it is chattel slavery. It is.
Torture, rape.
God damn it with these people. I gotta bleep these things before I air them.
Yeah.
Murder, and family separation were all commonplace examples of the kinds of impunity that slave masters could use to try and create this docility among the Africans. Yet again, this was a far cry from what was legislated in Old Testament servitude.
Legislated, he says.
Yeah.
God decreed shit. Okay, that's legislation. Sure.
Yeah. It's the same thing.
The book of Leviticus, for example, notes that the master is to treat his slave as a yearly servant and is not to rule ruthlessly over him.
If he's an Israeli,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, he our apologist here, he kind of messed up because that passage from Leviticus goes to great pains to say you should not treat them as slaves if they're Hebrews. Let's see, if your fellow Israelis become poor, where the hell is it? Maybe it's further down. Yeah, poor and sell themselves to you. Do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents until the year of Jubilee, and yada, yada, yada. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. All that happy crap.
Yeah. Like you just said, it goes through lengths to distinguish, to make sure that it is clear that the ones who you don't rule over ruthlessly are your fellow Israelites. In that, so it says, it reiterates it at the bottom, but just a couple of sentences above what you just highlighted there, it says it again. So in a very short amount of time, it says, don't rule over Israelites ruthlessly. There is definitely a clear distinction between how you should rule over your Israelite slaves and your non-Israelite slaves.
Yeah, and in a way, the reason I titled this the way I did is because it literally makes me sick that he invokes how African Americans feel about the legacy of slavery, and then goes on to talk about biblical slavery while ignoring the slavery part of the slavery in the Bible. He wants to only focus on this one narrow portion of the overall servitude system.
Yeah. To be fair, if you ignore the slavery part of the slavery, then the slavery is not so bad.
Yeah, I suppose so. Well, in a way, we have a similar situation in the U.S. today. Not so much with the slavery part, but with homelessness, right? Like, there's a huge homelessness problem in the U.S. We all know this. But as long as we all ignore it, it doesn't seem like such a big problem, does it?
Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right.
Now, this isn't to say that there were never times when a master mistreated his servants. It's not what I'm saying at all. But the point is that if any such treatment did occur, it was deemed as morally unacceptable, and there are various Old Testament laws that will support this idea.
No, he just lied. He just lied. He just told a lie. He flat out lied.
Yeah, like the only limit anybody's been able to point to and show me is that if you beat them with a rod and they die because of the rod, you have to be able to prove it was from the rod, then the slave owner is to be punished. And again, every other thing, even taking your father or mother's name in vain or whatever, all death. Just straight up death. Yeah. Every law is death, except that one. If you murder your slave, not death. It doesn't say what, but it's not death.
Yeah,
It's in the context of the rest of the laws, it's the jaywalking of offenses. It is the least criminal thing you can possibly do.
It's the jaywalking offenses. Yeah, I like that.
It's also important that we consider what formed the grounding or the moral foundations that established how the Israelites were to treat others. Number one, this uniquely Judeo-Christian notion.
Oh, it bugs the hell out of me when somebody says Judeo-Christian. Because
Yeah,
you've all heard this before, so I'll spare you the rant. Judeo-Christian is a bullshit made-up term, not real.
yeah, and then what bothered me more a little bit about it was that he says uniquely, as if they're just okay.
Yeah, because it's not like Islam also is part of this tradition, or the other Abrahamic faiths. There's like 7 of them that no one talks about ever. And the Zoroastrians, where the Hebrews got much of their laws and ideas about what a god could or should be.
Sure, and not to mention the other roughly 150,000 years of human history prior to all of the Judeo, or I guess it would just be Judeo at the time, but I mean, humans have been around for a little bit. Is he suggesting that for the, whenever modern humans walk the earth for 150, 200, whatever it is, that we were just like savage, brutal murderers, and we just went around like, well, no. It's not uniquely Judeo-Christian, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah. There's very, very little within the ancestral Christian traditions that is actually from, like, they always say, oh, God invented marriage. Okay, so anybody who is getting married before, the year 0, that's not a real marriage, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that was something different.
That all human beings are made in the image of God, which means that in spite of one's social status.
Yeah, that's not true either. Like, there are religions, like many First Nations traditions, where the elements are gods, or there are spirits that are gods. And sometimes it's your ancestors, so they do have the same image as you, but sometimes not. But out of the major religions, all the Buddhas, they're pretty anthropomorphic. All the Hindu gods, even the ones who are like monkeys and elephants and things, they're anthropomorphic versions of those animals. So not every god, but the vast majority of gods humans have ever concocted has been made in the image of man. That is not anywhere close to being a unique thing to the Jewish and succeeding traditions.
Yeah.
But I digress. But he started it.
Yeah, he started it. I was hoping that he would mention this sooner. Are you able to give it like a little bit of a speed boost or no?
I think so. Let's see.
Just maybe just a little.
Playback speed. Yeah, let's.
He's not going to say anything interesting, but I just want to hear him say that part if I can.
All right.
Or ethnicity, we are all of equal worth and value because we were made to be like God, but not the same as God. The Old Testament character Job affirms this idea of equality when speaking of the master-slave relationship. He says, "Did not he who made me in the womb make them?" Of course, referring to his servants. And he also goes on to say, "Did not the same one form us both within our mothers?" Now, secondly, Israel's own history of enslavement in Egypt served as a reminder of how it should treat others. Old Testament scholar Christopher J.H. Wright notes, Israel looked back to 4 centuries of slavery in a foreign land, which had become increasingly oppressive, inhumane.
It's interesting that they were enslaved in Egypt for roughly 400 years, and the Exodus, where slave laws are written, the Exodus is the story of their escape from Egypt to start their own land. So you're telling me that God had a clean slate, a fresh start, because they wouldn't have had their own laws yet. They weren't a nation yet. They literally just escaped. So they had nothing to go on. They had no written rules, no written regulations. They were essentially a wild people going to start a nation. And God could have just said, "Hey, you know that thing that was so awful in Egypt? We're not going to do that here. We're not going to do the slavery thing in my nation." He had this golden opportunity to say, you know how awful that was? We're not doing that. And clearly he missed his golden opportunity. I just find it interesting that God, you know, had the opportunity. He missed it. But yeah, we can keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. He expressly says in Exodus several times, both him and Moses are constantly reiterating, as we were slaves in Egypt, yada, yada, yada. Like, there's this constant reminder that they just escaped from slavery, and yet same book, rules for keeping slaves.
Yeah, they're not improving upon or protecting the slaves because they didn't have slaves. There was no slavery yet. I guess you could almost argue that God did invent slavery in Israel because they didn't have it prior to the rules of Exodus. So, I'm taking it back. You know what? God did invent Israeli slavery. He did invent Israeli slavery.
That's fair. That's a fair point.
And unbearable. The experience colored their subsequent attitude to slavery enormously. Now, there's much more.
Not enough to ban it, though.
Not enough to ban it.
Okay, so ancient Persia, right? They did have rules for slaves that were better than the Israeli rules for slaves, but it wasn't practiced really. Like, there were a few outsiders who came in and made use of the laws and whatnot, but the actual Persians themselves, they prided themselves on no longer having slaves, because even though it was allowed under the law, they saw it as virtuous to not be a slave owner. They were legally allowed to do it, but they morally were above it. So it wasn't as big a thing in Persia at the time when they were making these laws. And then here's the Israelis going, oh, we're going to be even more moral and, you know, slavery for everyone, when they could have. It could have been legal. It could have been condoned by God, and they could have chosen just not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not what they did.
No.
More that can be said about this topic. You know, there's the question of non-Hebrew slaves, and there's instances of slavery.
There it is.
Yes. No, he does not go any further into it, but I was shocked when he said that, because he's the only one yet that I've heard even mention that there was a different form of rules and regulations for non-Hebrew slaves. It was shocking. I think he goes on to say that he's going to talk about it further, but as far as I can tell, he did not.
Yeah, I remember him saying something like that, and he doesn't really get into it further. And now,
No, he does not mention it anymore. It's one sentence, but I feel like for an apologist to even bring that up is probably apologetic heresy.
Yeah, he's a very bad, naughty apologist. But then there's the even bigger question: why do we care? Now, of course, we care because it's people holding up this moral horror and saying this is the guidebook for all morality. That's a problem. But it points at an even bigger problem. And I'm going to let the man, the myth, the legend himself, Matt Dillahunty, address this one. So here's a clip from an atheist experience from 2019. And let's have a listen.
Like, people would be servants for a certain amount of years to pay off a debt.
No, Ryan, no. Indentured servitude is already immoral, and slaves didn't necessarily have rights, but that's not what we're talking about here. Let me cut to the chase. Ryan, would you be my slave under the rules established in Exodus 21?
If I could be, he's saying slave, but it doesn't say slave, it says servant.
Oh my God. Ryan, would you be my servant under the rules of Exodus? No, shut up. Would you be my servant under the rules of Exodus 21?
It's a bad idea. Don't do it.
Why does this take even half a fucking second? This is the embarrassing thing. I'm gonna let you go, Ryan. I've already hung up because I want you to go and think about this. I'm not joking when I talk about how much this breaks my fucking heart to watch the poison that religion has imbued people with, to the point where they will bend over backwards and hem and haw about the easiest question I could ask. Are people property? Can you beat them? Would you be my slave, my servant, if you want to pedantically? It wasn't written in English anyway. Under what Exodus 21 says. It is grossly immoral. It is an embarrassment that anybody would pause for more than half a second to answer that question. Think about what your religion has done to your head. It is making you a slave to the religion because you no longer have the free will and exercise to say, this is wrong.
And that is it. That's...
Yeah.
It's everything that needs to be said from my perspective, because fundamentally, it's not about whether there's this one gaping flaw of morality in the Bible. It's that the people who believe it feel they have to justify this. They have to make it good when it is clearly not. And that kind of thinking infects everything else they do, whether it's hating on LGBT people or trying to, deregulate businesses so they can destroy the environment, whatever it is. Their entire thinking process is poisoned by the contradictions in this book and the fact that they have to get used to justifying the absolute moral horrors and pretend they're good. Once you get used to doing that, once you disable your critical thinking faculties, you become vulnerable to all kinds of things, and it's harmful to yourself and it's harmful to others. And it's not just about the slavery. It's about everything else in the book. It's about that passage in Leviticus that says homosexuality is an abomination. People say it must be good because it comes from the good book. It's hate, but it must be good. It's about every single thing all the way through. Slaves, obey your masters. The fact that people have to go out of their way to justify this instead of saying to themselves the obvious thing, this is clearly wrong, and I probably should think about whether I really want to invest myself and my mind and my spirit into this ideology. And instead of doing that, instead of challenging their beliefs and following it through, they just make excuses. And once you start doing that, it poisons everything. So that's my sermon for today.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's a common question of like, why start an atheist YouTube channel? Or why go to do things like Matt Dillahunty does? And it's because of what you just said, because these thoughts and these ideas and this most importantly, this way of thinking, this way of problem solving, this way of navigating through the world where you have to justify slavery or justify, like you said, hating LGBT, where you it's not that you necessarily want to do it, but you have to, because if you even for a moment acknowledge that, wow, maybe that's wrong, then the building blocks start to fall, because God cannot be wrong. So yeah, when you have to think this way, we start seeing it pop up in our legislation, in our schools, in our daily lives, in our protests, in the news, in the media, as we just saw in Florida, the kind of atrocities that are going on down there right now. It all stems from this way of thinking. And so that's why I started a YouTube channel, or that's why I talk to your uncle or your neighbor or whoever else may be in your life that thinks this way, because you can change minds one at a time. So if anybody comes across this video, will it change their mind? Maybe, maybe not, but I think it's a worthwhile venture. That's for sure.
It's as many other atheists have said over the years. Seth Andrews said, if I can change one person's mind and turn them away from this horrible, horrible way of trying to live life and trying to control others' lives, then it's all worth it. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's why we all do what we do. It's not just to pat ourselves on the back and be, oh, you know what? I agree with you. You agree with me. Aren't we all so smart? It's because these beliefs are fucking harmful. You have to buy into the idea that evil is good. You have to buy into the idea that you are evil. And once you accept that you are evil, then perpetuating other people's evil is no big deal. And it doesn't matter because you have a get out of jail free card. All you have to do is suck God's dick and you're off the naughty list.
Yes.
It's like that fella said in the very beginning. You know what? I'll play the clip again.
I think that's what distinguishes from Christianity from every other religion, because he's still talking about being a good person. And Christianity comes and says, no, you're incapable of being a good person. You're an evil person. You're a terrible person.
And that's it. You're an evil person. You're a terrible person. Well, you know what? We atheists, we don't believe that. Not all of us are humanists, but a huge proportion of us are. Because we think there's good in humans. Sure, humans are capable of some horrible, despicable things. But they don't have to be. We all have the choice. Every choice we make, we can choose to do better. We can choose to do good. We can choose good intentions. We have that capability. And to back up these religions that tell you that you're evil, that everyone else is evil, and that evil things are good, it just, well, like Matt said, it breaks my fucking heart.
Yeah, that you were literally born this way. You were born evil. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's sad. I couldn't imagine going through life thinking that I was a sinner or evil or just inherently bad. It must be hard. It must be hard. But maybe not so much like when you do have the God. It's like the old. I'm sure it was probably before Hitchens, but I know Hitchens has said it. They tell you you're sick and then offer you the cure. So I guess if you have that imaginary cure, then maybe it isn't so bad. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's the classic snake oil sales thing. Oh, this will first we have to convince you you're sick, and then we'll sell you the medicine. And that's been the industry all the way back to before the fall of Western Rome. It's just the reason that Christianity became the official religion is because the rulers at the time realized it was a great way to control people.
Yeah.
It's almost custom made for it, and it's just disgusting. So in a way, I suppose Paul was right when he wrote that everyone is a slave of Christ. Oh well. So, on that happy, uplifting note...
yeah, right?
You know, but I did want to relate it back to why it matters. Why do we always harp on this? Why it is important? Because it's just some old dusty book, right? But it's also what people today believe and the things they have to do in order to justify that belief that lead them so very wrong. So thank you guys so much for joining us, hanging out with us. I know I've been shit at keeping up with the side chat, but we had a lot to talk about. But I really am glad you guys are here. Thanks, Nara, for joining me. Before we go, do you have anything coming up that you want to direct people towards?
Oh boy. Unfortunately, no. So I do have a relatively busy schedule outside of YouTube. So it's actually been a while since I've created anything, maybe a week or whatever. So I don't have anything planned, but that's not an effect of my relatively busy life. That's just because I don't plan. So what I'll do is I'll go through my day and I will look at videos that come across my recommended or whatever it's called on YouTube, the suggested videos. And when I see one that looks interesting, I'll put it to my watch later, and then I'll come down to my little studio and then I'll hit record. That's how I kind of wing my way through my YouTube videos. So no, I don't have anything planned, but I always try to get more and more content out, and it's been a lot of fun so far. So definitely expect more.
For sure. Yeah, there, people have this whole idea, like best practices and all the YouTube gurus. You have to do this and you have to do this, and it becomes a freaking job. You don't have to. Do what you want to do as you can do it. It's
I would argue the only thing you have to do is enjoy what you're doing. If you're having a good time, then then hey, if is your content great? I don't, not yours, but just in general, is what you're doing great? Like, I don't know, but do you enjoy it? If the answer is yes, then keep on keeping on. That's all that really matters.
This content, this is terrible shit. I mean, look at this crappy background.
Oh, this thumbnail, bro. Oh my god, the thumbnail.
I'll pop us out for a second so people can see. But we have to be quiet when we're out of the stream.
Yeah, you're like, you sent me the thumbnail and you're like, is this one okay? And I open it up and it's that. I'm like, what do you mean is it okay? That's it was, yeah. Well, I mean, you saw. It was awesome.
Yeah, well, like I said then, I feel a little odd about them sometimes because, you know, again with the gurus, everybody says that the most important thing to get eyeballs on your videos is thumbnails. And I look at the thumbnails for successful channels, and they're like monocolor with one cutout person on them, and they've got, you know, 300,000 views in 2 hours. And then I look at ones that are like really elaborately done, like this one, and they get 50 views in 3 days. And I'm like, okay.
I haven't figured it out because not that any of my videos do wildly well, but they do reach into the high hundreds. And so when I do get a video that gets like 600 or 700 views, or, you know, I think my highest one has like 900 or whatever. When I do get that, and I noticed, okay, people are clicking on this more, I will try to recreate that style of thumbnail, and then the video just bombs. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's like clearly that's not it. Yeah, we all have to do our own evolutionary process and try things and use natural selection to figure out what works. Unfortunately, nobody seems to have actually figured out what actually works because everybody's got different ideas, and when you try them, it's hit or miss.
Yeah.
So, you know, c'est la vie. But yeah, enough talking shop.
yeah. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. Yeah. I mean, you know, a lot of people enjoy the sidetracks, and honestly, it's a lighter topic than what we were just talking about. So that's all good too. But yeah, thank you guys all so much for joining us, and yeah, keep your eye out for another video from Nara. Tomorrow I've got the usual Saturday video at 11:30, and that'll auto redirect you to Aaron's channel where we'll be doing Blasphemers Bible at noon. And then Sunday, I'm back on Aaron's for reading Book of Mormon, and then immediately after, Aaron's coming over here for the Atheist Lives, and, you know, other things are happening. So, all good stuff.
Yeah, it's cool that you landed Aaron Ra. That's
well,
cool.
I mean, Aaron, one of the cool things about Aaron is that he's willing to talk to literally anyone. So, I don't really take that as a feather in my cap. It's great that he's coming, but at the same time, you know.
Hey, you know, cut that out that you just said that. Cut that out of this video and just take the win. Like, you got to book this guy out months in advance.
You want me to edit a live stream? What the hell, man?
Oh yeah.
What kind of shop do you think I'm running here? Alrighty, once again, thank you guys so much for joining us. We're actually going to go this time, but please know that you all are appreciated, and hanging out with you all is one of my favorite things to do in the whole universe. So thank you so much, and we will see you the next time we get up to mischief and chaos and, you know, insert end of video tagline here.